All right, settling in to keep the dogs distracted while I'm up here. These treats stuffed with peanut butter should do it, and just put some peanut butter in this one too. All right, so with the dogs set, let's get started. So I'm going to talk today about uh, time in Messiaen and try to dig into time, duration, uh, eternity, timelessness, questions like that. Like, what do those words mean? What does Messiaen think about those ideas in his liturgical context? How does he point towards those ideas with his music? What can we as musical thinkers gain from that? And then what can we as sort of general human beings inquiring about the nature of our spirit, how can we learn from that? So at the same time, I'm also looking at the next chapter in techniques, which is where Messiaen gets into the modes of limited transposition. And there's a lot of material there. I want to present it as a cohesive unit, whether it's a cohesive set of multiple videos or whether it's one much longer video. I haven't decided yet, but I'm not going to let my indecision prevent me from continuing to put stuff out on related subjects. So sometime in the next couple of months, I hope to release my thoughts on Messiaen's modes. And in the meantime, we'll focus on questions like this. So time, duration, timelessness, eternity are ideas that I've talked about before in these videos, because Messiaen is clear, I think, that the idea of a non-retrogradable rhythm implies a stasis because of its unique qualities of unclear whether it's being played forward or backwards. Messiaen is using that to create an affect in his music of stasis, of stasis. And that affect, that surface impact, leads us to an openness to consider time. Now, this is a little bit different, I think, from what Messiaen actually says. But in fairness, Messiaen isn't entirely clear. And if you read the literature, if you read people who have done dissertations on this topic, it's clear that Messiaen, in his program notes and in his writings about duration, either in the techniques or in the later treatise, does tend to use the words interchangeably. But there's an interesting distinction to be drawn, whether or not it's the words that we're using or that Messiaen is using. But let's start with this idea. Well, first, let me just start with, as always, the idea is that the study of this music allows us to see the craft with which Messiaen has created a musical experience. That musical experience is intended to propel us, the listener, into a broader experience. So whether it's within the context of an eternal heaven, or whether it's in the context of a broader sense of spiritual connection between humanity and the cosmos, the music is a technique to compel that experience, that confrontation even with the eternal, with the immortal, with the undying, with the unborn. So with that in the background, I'm indebted. Let me look up so I make sure I get this right. I'm indebted to an essay called "On Time and Eternity in Messiaen" by Benedict Taylor. And this essay, I believe, appears in a collection of essays published in Australia as part of the 100th centenary of Messiaen's birth. I found the individual PDF on academia.edu, Benedict Taylor. So I read through this. It's a really good essay. A couple of points that I walked away from it with that really resonated with what I'm trying to get across today. The distinction between eternity and sempiternity. Sempiternity, S-E-M-P-I, eternity as opposed to eternity. There's a very nuanced distinction. The distinction between time that lasts forever, eternity, so the idea of unending duration, as opposed to sempiternity, which is a step aside from time, or where time is no longer an attribute. Time is no longer part of the phenomenon. Look, this is a question that really doesn't have an answer short of our own mortality or some kind of ecstatic remembrance of our broader nature, our truer nature. That ecstatic remembrance is part of what Messiaen's music accomplishes. Or Messiaen's music is part of what is, yes, let me rephrase that. Messiaen's music is one part of one possible approach to achieve that remembrance. Sempiternity, the absence of time, the end of time. This is, I think, a better understanding of the title of the quartet, Quartet for the End of Time. The end of time is not the end of all things. It isn't the apocalypse. It isn't destruction of the physical plane, physical dimensions. It isn't a clock stopping. It is the position where time not just ceases, but is no longer a factor. Here's one way that I think about this. If we look at musical analysis as a mathematical process, you can look at a sine wave, and you can draw out a sine wave as the change in amplitude over time, right? The frequency, the period of the wave is constant. The distance between the peaks are the same, the distance between the troughs are the same, the period is the same, but amplitude is changing over time. Okay. Amplitude domain analysis. And you can do waveform analysis on the most complex wave structures and see the change in amplitude over time. We're very familiar with this view. We see it in Ableton, we see it in DAW, we see it, we see it as a representation of sound, of music, of speech, the sine wave, and the complexification of that as the waveform represents a richer timbre. If you were to then say, yes, it's changed, the amplitude is changing, but the frequency is the same. So then we draw the change in frequency over time, and it becomes a flat line. The change in amplitude has been made irrelevant because we're looking at a different factor, a different attribute. We're looking at frequency. Frequency doesn't change. So in our first graph of the A440 sine wave, amplitude changes over time. In our second graph, where we're now looking at frequency, we have a flat line. Frequency can change, and our line won't change. timbre can be more complicated than a sine wave, and then we'll have a much more elaborate spectrographic representation of the sound. But it's a frequency over time, change in frequency over time. So 2 different views, 2 different domains. Now the question then, by analogy, what would be the third graph where time is no longer the x-axis? Where time is the y-axis. So the same way the frequency is constant as the amplitude changes. What would be your perspective in which time is constant and some other dimension changes? That flip is into the sempiternal. That idea of analogy is actually taken directly from Flatland, right? Because the thinking in Flatland is you have a point to a line has the same relationship as a line to a square, which has the same relationship as a square to a cube. And then our square, who understands now what a cube is, having met a sphere, asks the question, well, what has the relationship to a cube the same as the cube has to a square? And for this question, he's imprisoned. So we're not going to have anything quite as drastic as that. But think about the temporal domain as one of the domains that can be extracted and made irrelevant by considering a different domain. That is the sempiternal. At least that is how I consider the sempiternal. These are not easy terms to think through, right? The idea of duration that continues forever. Now, I just don't buy it, because nothing goes forever. There's no, and I know that what we're saying here is the continuation of some particular physical state. But time is bound up in the physical state. Time is not a backdrop against which physical motion occurs, against which biology unfolds, against which cultures arise and planets are formed and whatever sequence of events we want to think through. Time is not a canvas upon which these things happen. It is part of why it happens. Because in order for us to perceive something, it has to have unfolded in time. There has to be a temporal duration in order for us to perceive something. And I think I buy into that. But I certainly think, and this I think gets to questions the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, the early church fathers pondered and considered. Time is a physical dimension. As physical as height and depth and breadth. Duration is a physical dimension. And because it is a physical dimension, it is a conditioned dimension. It arises the same way that my body was born and evolved over time, gets older, gets sick, and eventually will dissolve back into its constituent elements. And at no point can I identify a solid, unchanging constituent part. And time is part of that. I am time bound. Time is bound. It's a two-way relationship. Exist within time. Time is part of my physical being. It is part of this camera. It is part of the laptop I'm reading from. It is part of the dogs who are now sleeping, having fallen into a peanut butter induced coma. It is part of the nature of our universe. And as such, time is a thing that occurs and then stops occurring. Maybe occurs again. I don't know. Those are questions that aren't even really questions. But it explains why, for myself, uh, the, the idea of sempiternity is a more copacetic, more simpatico. So I have peanut butter on my computer keys. So it's really not good, is it? Take it into the Apple store and say my computer doesn't work. Actually, that happened to me at work one time. I turned a laptop in, so it doesn't work anymore. And the guy opened it up, called me up the next day and said, "Do you know there's ramen noodles in here?" I was like, "What? No way." Go figure. Now, in Messiaen's music, he creates rhythmic patterns and often talks about rhythm. He calls himself not a composer, but a rhythmicist. And it is the treatment of rhythm and meter and the patterns that unfold within those that elucidate this idea in Messiaen's music. The complex unfolding of augmented rhythms, the canonical treatment of rhythms, the unfolding of rhythmic patterns from the inside out. These are hard things to hear, even when I'm listening for them. When I have a score and I've studied it, I can be cognitively aware of it. But is it a symbol or is it an experience? And I guess the answer, like everything, is it's both. But it's a useful distinction to draw. Does Messiaen, the composer, put these rhythmic patterns in there, expecting that a listener will absorb to the point of cognition? Are they there because Messiaen, the rhythmicist, believes that our physical bodies will respond subconsciously, subcognitively, and become entrained somehow in a way that he, as an experimentalist, understands will induce a certain spiritual or mental response? And I don't mean that spiritual and mental are the same, but maybe just different ways of thinking about how we might react to a complex rhythmic pattern that has been created with the intention of inducing an affect that is spiritual, liturgical, Catholic, or not, depending on what's filled within the brain. These are like pebbles dropped in the pool of the mind, and the content of the mind is what determines the form of the content of the waves. The form of the wave is caused by the musical pebble. The fact that my brain is filled with Terence McKenna and Dzogchen Buddhist studies means that the waves that I experience will be different from someone who's hearing Messiaen's music in the cathedral in Paris. Is it a symbol or is it an experience? Again, for myself, and I imagine for many of you listening, it's the experience. Whether or not we've studied, whether or not we can actually point to a particular experience or a particular pattern. The study is useful, maybe necessary, the same way that the practice of meditation is an experience that requires mental study ahead of time. You have to learn as you practice. So you know what to look for. You know what to experience. The same is true for Messiaen's music. Symbol, experience, maybe the symbol points to the experience. In an earlier video, we talked about Messiaen's attachment to symbolist poetry. The idea that what we're experiencing in the art, whether it's poem or painting or music, is there to indicate a reality beyond what we're experiencing. So I think that covers all of the notes I've got here. I actually had a lot more notes, but I'm looking at them now, and I feel like I would be redundant. So if you've enjoyed this, please, if you've enjoyed this and you haven't subscribed, subscribe. If you've gotten this far and you're a subscriber, you must surely be part of a scene with many other like-minded people who would enjoy subscribing to this channel as well. So take advantage of your friendships to build the audience here. I've been getting more notes than usual lately, and I really appreciate hearing from everybody, particularly if there are questions and we can get into a bit of back and forth. So please either leave a comment, drop me an email, zenglop@gmail.com, or well, I guess that's it. I try to use Twitter, but I'm not on Twitter. So with that, keep your wits about you, and more to come.